They didn't call his name with anticipation. They called it to fill a slot, like crossing something off a list. Elian Cruz. Original composition. There was a pause, then a rustle of candy wrappers, a cough, some snickering from the back. No spotlight followed him as he walked. No music cued his arrival. He stepped barefoot onto the stage, slowly, carefully, like the wooden floorboards might reject him. Like even the light might decide he didn't belong. His hoodie, thin and stretched at the elbows, hung from his shoulders like it had learned to do so on its own. His jeans bore the faded signature of time and wear, one knee patched with a square of fabric that used to be his mother's apron. His violin case, slung in one trembling hand, was not the polished, velvet-lined kind the other contestants had. It was soft-sided, frayed. One zipper didn't close all the way. He opened it gently and took out the violin like it might shatter, in his hands. And maybe it could have. The body was cracked down one side and held together with a line of glue that had yellowed in the sun. Only 3 strings remained. The 4th, long gone, had been replaced with a thin strand of fishing wire. The bridge was crooked, the bow was unraveling, and still he lifted it to his chin. In the crowd, someone laughed softly. Not cruelly, just carelessly. A sound that said, "This will be over soon." 2 girls near the front leaned together, whispering behind their hands. A boy with his phone out whispered, "Bet he found that in the trash." The auditorium was a patchwork of noise, of expectation, of assumption. No one knew him. No one wanted to. He was a footnote, a filler act, a strange little boy from no one knew where. And soon they thought he would leave in the same silence he came in. But Elian didn't come here for applause. He came here because the silence had become too loud to hold. He closed his eyes. Not to shut them out, but to find a place inside himself where it didn't matter, where it was just him and the sound. Then he lifted the bow. The first note was barely a whisper. It scratched, faltered, stumbled over its own breath. But he didn't stop. The second note trembled. The third hung in the air like a question no one had ever dared to ask. And suddenly, something shifted. It wasn't the music. It was the way the air began to listen. The girl stopped whispering. The boy lowered his phone. A teacher leaned forward in her seat. Her hand unconsciously rested over her heart, and Elian kept playing. There was no accompaniment, no stage lights dancing above him. Only a boy, a broken violin, and a story that had waited too long to be told. The melody wasn't complex. It moved like the wind through a half-open window on a cold night. It faltered in places, and one note wavered so far off key it nearly collapsed. But no one laughed, because there was something in it, something that didn't belong in a school auditorium at all, something too honest, too fragile. It was the sound of the night his father died in the back seat of their van. It was the sound of rain leaking through the roof of a shelter, of hunger swallowed quietly, of a mother humming lullabies with a tired voice she could barely lift. It was not perfect, but it was real, and that made it unbearable. By the end, he was no longer a boy with a violin. He was the boy who had made the silence listen, and when the final note fell, not into thunderous applause, but into a stillness deeper than anything the room had held before, that's when someone stood, not out of performance, not because it was time, but because they had to. One by one, the audience followed, rising without quite knowing why. A standing ovation, not for brilliance, but for truth. And somewhere off stage, in the shadow of the velvet curtain, a man stepped forward. Silver hair, navy coat, and eyes that had seen talent in the most sacred and sorrowful of places. He didn't clap. He didn't smile. He whispered to himself, "That wasn't taught." The concert ended hours ago, but the sound of it stayed in Elian's chest like a second heartbeat. Not the applause, not the gasps, not even the silence, but the feeling of it, the weight, the stillness. That moment when the note stopped vibrating, in the wood, and began echoing in other people's bones. That's what stayed. Now he sat in the back seat of the van, violin case tucked between his knees. The dome light overhead flickered once, then died for good. His mother didn't turn on the engine. They couldn't afford the gas. The lot behind the grocery store was mostly empty, save for a few distant trucks sleeping in silence. Cold air crept in through the cracked window seams. The windshield was fogged from their breath. His mother sat motionless in the driver's seat, hands resting on the steering wheel like she wasn't sure what came next. Then, without looking back, she spoke. "Did they hear you, mijo?" Elian looked down at his hands, still shaking a little, and nodded. "I think so." She turned. The streetlight outside lit her profile, cheekbones sharpened by years of missed meals, soft eyes dimmed but not extinguished. She searched his face for something, proof maybe that it hadn't been a dream. "Did they listen?" He hesitated, then whispered, "Yes." Camilla Cruz wasn't a woman who cried often. Life had demanded she learn how to hold things in, hold her breath, hold her tongue, hold back the ache when the manager cut her shift. Again, hold her son tighter when the nights got colder. But tonight, in that fragile pause between what had just happened and what might never happen again, she closed her eyes and wept. Softly, quietly, like everything else in her life. Elian didn't speak. He reached forward, rested his chin against the back of her seat. "They stood up, Mama, all of them." Her breath caught. Someone said, "I made them feel something." She turned fully now, reached back and took his hand in both of hers. "Of course you did. They finally heard what I've heard every night, baby. Since you were 8. Since you played that broken piece of wood like it was sacred." Outside, wind skimmed across the van's roof, tugging at the loose aluminum. With a hollow sigh, inside Elian shifted, opened the case once more and lifted the violin gently, like it might wake if he moved too fast. He held it to his chest, not to play, but to feel. He remembered the first time he saw it, found in a dumpster behind the thrift shop. Its belly cracked, strings curled like old hair, and a splinter the size of a pencil sticking out the back. His father had been alive then. He had laughed when Elian brought it home. "That's not an instrument," he said. "That's firewood." But Elian hadn't let go. He cradled it like a secret, like something no one else could see, and his father eventually had softened. "Then we'll fix it," he said. "We'll make it sing again." But his father never got to hear it sing. 3 months later, the cancer took him, fast, cruel. In the passenger seat of this very van, Camilla had driven all night trying to find a hospital that would take them without insurance. When the nurses finally opened the ER door, it was too late. Elian had sat in the back, his hands wrapped around the violin, and he hadn't let go. Now, years later, he still played for a man who couldn't hear him anymore, and for a woman who had never stopped listening. In the darkness, he began to hum, just barely, a ghost of a melody, the same one he'd played on stage. His mother closed her eyes. She knew that song. It didn't have a name, but it had a home. It was made from sleepless nights and half-whispered lullabies, from alleyway echoes and raindrops on the windshield, from the sound of train horns far away like something calling, but never stopping. "Did they believe in you?" she asked quietly. Elian stared at the ceiling. "I think one of them did." She tilted her head. "Who?" "An old man in a blue coat. He was backstage. He didn't clap, he just looked at me. And? He said, 'I've been searching for that sound for years.'" She said nothing, just smiled into the shadows as if remembering something from long ago. "Maybe he wasn't searching for the sound," she whispered. "Maybe he was searching for you." Outside, the wind shifted, a soft creak in the van's frame. Inside, a pause, a breath, and in that stillness, something sacred passed between them. Not a promise, not a plan, just a quiet knowing that tonight the world had opened, just a crack, just wide enough for one small voice to slip through. Before the contest, before the applause, Before the man in the blue coat with eyes like a storm waiting to break, there was only a sound, faint, flickering. Not even music yet, a note with no name in a van that barely held heat, from a boy who didn't know he was playing for anything but silence. That's where it lived. Elian learned to play the way a child learns to breathe underwater, slowly, painfully, by instinct and desperation. There were no lessons, no sheet music, no Rosen for the bow, no teacher standing beside him with gentle corrections. Only the internet on his mother's cracked phone, buffering endlessly in parking lot Wi-Fi, and a grainy video of a violinist whose fingers moved like language. He would pause the video every few seconds and mimic what he saw, over and over, until the moves were burned into his hands even if the notes came out broken. But Elian didn't need precision. He needed a voice. And in the hollow of that violin, half wood, half memory, he found it. At night, when his mother came back from her shift, shoes soaked from mopping floors, hands red from scrubbing, she wouldn't speak. She'd open the van door and listen. The music wasn't pretty, not at first. It squeaked, wobbled, sometimes gave up halfway through a phrase. But there was a hunger in it, a reaching, and she knew, deep in her tired chest, that her son wasn't trying to sound good. He was trying to say something he didn't have the words for. "Play it again," she would whisper when she had strength. And he would, for her, for the silence, for the feeling that maybe, just maybe, he existed beyond what the world had decided about him. Sometimes he played for his father. Late at night, when sleep wouldn't come, he'd crawl into the passenger seat, where the cushion still had a small indentation, like a ghost still sitting there, and play the songs his father used to hum when fixing engines. He didn't remember the words, but he remembered the sound. One of them was a soft, repetitive melody, a hum more than a song, a loop that held sorrow, like a lullaby holds a baby, gently but with weight. That was the first melody Elian ever recreated on his violin, not with accuracy, but with feeling. He called it Tuesday Night, even though no one had asked him for a title. It was Tuesday when his father left and never came back. Music for Elian wasn't a dream. It wasn't an ambition. It was a survival instinct, the way some children hide, the way some fight. Elian played. He played to push back the noise of hunger, the shrill sting of pity from teachers, the cold whisper of being invisible. He played when the heat ran out. He played when the school nurse handed him a granola bar and said too gently, "Everything okay at home?" He played when he couldn't answer. When the talent contest was announced, he didn't plan to join. He stood at the bulletin board in the school hallway, staring at the printed flyer like it was written in a different language. He didn't have the words. He didn't have the clothes. He didn't have the kind of violin that made people lean in with wonder. But still, his hand moved, almost without permission, almost against logic. He wrote his name on the sign-up sheet with a pencil stolen from the library. Elian Cruz, category, music, entry, original composition. That night he didn't tell his mother, not because he wanted to surprise her, but because he was afraid of failing, of the way her face would change if he let her hope and then broke it. So instead he practiced in secret, not scales, not exercises. He practiced truth. He played while washing the dishes in the plastic basin beside the front seat. He played while sitting on the curb waiting for the soup kitchen to open. He played with frozen fingers until the calluses split and bled, then healed stronger, and every time the song grew, not in size, but in depth. It was becoming something shaped like their nights, their bruises, their prayers, something that couldn't be tuned with pegs or polished with cloth, something that made the violin more than a violin. It made it a vessel, and still, no one knew. At school, he was the quiet one, the smelly one, the kid who never raised his hand. "Trailer trash," someone whispered once in gym. Another boy bumped into him on purpose and said, "Careful, or you'll break your toy violin." He didn't respond, didn't flinch. He just walked away, carrying his case like a secret. like a treasure. And that night, under a flickering street lamp behind the church, he added 3 new notes to his song. Sharp, bitter, but honest. Elian didn't know if the judges would understand, didn't know if the crowd would laugh. But he knew this. He had something to say, and a violin, cracked, patched, and aching, was the only way he knew how to say it. The list went up on a Thursday, just after lunch, taped to the green-painted wall outside the music room. The paper curled at the corners, flapping slightly in the hallway breeze like it knew what would come. Elian stood back from the crowd, not hiding. Not exactly, but not pushing forward either. He didn't need to see it, he already knew his name was there. Third from the bottom. Small, smudged pencil, Elian Cruz, music, original composition. Someone snorted. What's he gonna play the national anthem on rubber bands? A cluster of students laughed. One boy pulled out his phone and snapped a photo of the list. This is gonna be good, like car crash good. Elian turned away before they looked at him, not out of shame. He was used to being overlooked, but because something inside him was beginning to tremble. Not fear, not yet, but something more dangerous. Hope. The week before the contest passed like a slow bruise. Every hallway felt heavier. Every glance lingered just a little too long. Every conversation seemed to end the moment he approached. In his locker, he found a flyer someone had made, black and white printout, a photo of a cartoon violin melting. Above it, coming soon. World's worst musician live on stage. He read it, folded it, threw it away without a word. And then that night, he practiced. Again. His mother knew something had shifted. She wasn't the kind of woman who asked questions she didn't need answered. But she noticed things. The way Elian hummed under his breath while brushing his teeth. The way his fingers twitched while folding laundry. The way he stayed up later than usual, bowing invisible strings into the air like he was rehearsing for someone no one could see. One evening after her second shift, she reached for his violin case on the floor of the van and gently unzipped it. Her breath caught. The bridge had been reset, the tailpiece adjusted with care. One peg replaced with a bolt. The E-string, still fishing wire, tightly wound and tuned by hand. This wasn't the idle tinkering of a bored child. This was devotion. She didn't say anything when he came back from the gas station with a donated sandwich in hand. She didn't mention the flyer she found stuffed behind the seat. She didn't press, but later that night she pulled out his only collared shirt from the cardboard box at the back of the van. It was wrinkled, faded yellow with a stain at the hem, but she ironed it on her lap with the bottom of a hot skillet. She didn't say good luck. She only looked at him and whispered, "Let them hear you, Elian. Not your violin. You." The day of the contest came wrapped in storm clouds. The kind of day that smells like wet pavement and forgotten things. The school auditorium buzzed with chatter, folding chairs, and the squeal of microphone feedback. A banner hung crooked over the stage. River Heights Middle School Talent Showcase. All are welcome. All, but not all were expected. Elian waited behind the curtain, hands cold despite the heat of the room. Other performers passed him. Tight jeans, hair gel, choreographed smiles. A boy with a keyboard rolled his eyes as he passed. "You going up with that thing?" Elian didn't answer. He was too busy listening to his own heartbeat. And then, "Next, up," the MC said, voice cheerful but distracted. "We have an original violin piece by Elian Cruz." There was a pause, a beat too long, then a laugh. Someone clapped sarcastically, a crinkling of snack bags, a soft rising hum of disinterest, and Elian walked out into it. He didn't look out at the crowd. He didn't wave. He just stepped into the light like a boy walking into a rainstorm with no umbrella. Not trying to stay dry, just trying to stand tall. He wore the pale yellow shirt, ironed flat but still worn thin. His jeans were clean. His feet were bare. He took his place at the center of the stage, lifted his violin and held it to his chin. The spotlight flickered once. And then he began. The first note came like a memory whispered across a crack in the pew, or it wavered, not out of uncertainty but because it was real. He didn't aim for perfection. He aimed for truth. Each note was a breath taken in the cold. Each pause a moment his mother had waited too long in the clinic lobby. Each shift of bow against string was a night without dinner, a missed birthday, a whispered prayer on a steering wheel. He played not for the judges, not for the crowd, but for the little boy in the mirror who had grown used to disappearing. And as the music built, not louder but deeper, something began to shift. A teacher at the back of the auditorium sat up straighter. A boy who had been scrolling TikTok slowly lowered his phone. A girl in the front row stopped chewing mid-bite. The music didn't impress. It confessed. And by the time Elian reached the final phrase, a slow, trembling rise into a note that cracked, halfway through and still held on, there was only silence. Not the kind that's empty. The kind that listens. When the last note faded, no one moved. Then quietly, a single clap. Then another. And then the sound rose like a wave breaking against itself. A standing ovation. From people who didn't know his name. From classmates who hadn't looked him in the eye in months. From teachers who had only ever marked him present without really seeing him. And backstage, half hidden in the shadows, a man with silver hair and a navy coat watched with eyes that glimmered. Not with surprise, but recognition. He turned to the woman beside him and whispered, That sound is going to change everything." He didn't remember walking off the stage, only the feel of the bow loosening in his hand, only the hush that followed him like a cloak. His heart was still beating inside his ribs like it wasn't sure it could trust the quiet. The kind of quiet that wasn't empty but full, thick with something unsaid like a held breath after a miracle. Elian blinked under the wings of the curtain. His feet were trembling, his fingertips burned, but his soul was still singing. Backstage, the air buzzed with the leftover electricity of something holy. No one said a word to him at first, not because they didn't care, but because they didn't know how. What do you say to a boy who just took everything broken inside him and turned it into sound? Some kids stared, others glanced away, suddenly, awkward. A teacher dabbed her eyes with a napkin trying to pretend she hadn't cried. And Elian stood there in his patched jeans, holding his cracked violin like it was the only thing in the world that still made sense. Then, the man stepped forward. He was tall, not imposing, but still, the kind of tall that carries history. Hair the color of first snow, swept neatly back, navy coat, hands in his pockets. He moved slowly like he was walking through something sacred. He didn't smile, didn't introduce himself right away. Just looked at Elian with a quiet reverence like someone who had been looking for something a very long time. And just found it. Then he said, "I'm Julian Bennett. I conduct the National Youth Philharmonic." Elian stared at him, confused, unsure if this was still part of the contest. But the man continued, his voice soft, firm, weathered like a cello played too long. "I wasn't supposed to be here tonight, but something told me to stop in." A pause, a breath. "That piece, it was yours?" Elian nodded, too stunned to speak. "You didn't play with technique," Julian said quietly. "You played with testimony." He stepped closer, lowered his voice, as if sharing a secret not meant for the world. "You told a story most musicians train a lifetime to fake, but you lived it." From behind them, a janitor turned off one row of stage lights, and in the dimming glow, Julian reached into his coat and pulled out a card. "We have a summer program in New York, full scholarship, for musicians who don't fit the mold, but break it." He hesitated. "I'd like to offer you an audition." Elian stared down at the card like it might vanish if he blinked. It felt too heavy in his hand for a piece of paper. Then he whispered, "I don't have lessons. I don't read music. I don't even have 4 strings." Julian knelt to his level. "Son," he said gently, "you have something no conservatory can teach." A pause. "You have a voice that makes people stop. That's rarer than perfect pitch." An hour later, Camila Cruz burst through the auditorium doors. still in her work apron, covered in flour and oil from the diner. Elian turned, and his mother's face, creased with fatigue, fear, love, lit up the moment she saw him standing there with the card in his hand. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't need to. She just ran to him, pulled him in close, and held him so tightly he could feel her heart pounding against his ribs. "Tell me it's real," she whispered, and he did. That night back in the van, neither of them slept. Not out of worry. Not this time, but because the world, after so long, finally felt like it was turning toward them, not away. Camilla lit a small candle on the dashboard, one she kept for nights when they needed comfort more than light. She turned. To her son, brushed the hair from his eyes. "Whatever happens next," she said, "you already won. You found your voice and they heard it." Elian looked at his violin resting beside him. 3 strings, 1 bolt, a crack down the neck sealed with glue that still smelled faintly of lemon. Not perfect, not expensive, not whole, but enough, more than enough. He whispered a small prayer, not to be famous, not even to be chosen, just to never forget what it felt like when the whole room listened, not because they had to, but because they couldn't help it. Outside, rain tapped gently on the roof, the kind of sound that makes you believe, if only for a little while, that the world might still be beautiful. Inside, a boy lay awake with music in his bones, and a door had opened. They left before dawn. The van, old and rattling, rolled out of the parking lot like it wasn't sure it could handle the journey. Camilla drove with both hands on the wheel, her lips pressed together, eyes scanning every turn like the road itself might change its mind. Elian sat in the passenger seat, the violin case balanced carefully on his lap, cradled like something fragile and holy. The card from Julian Bennett was tucked into the inside pocket of his jacket, creased now, but unreadable from the outside. He hadn't shown it to anyone else. It didn't feel like something you shared. Not yet. It felt like something you guarded. New York came too quickly. One moment they were passing endless fields, sun slanting through the windows. Then suddenly, steel, noise, sky too high to touch. The buildings leaned in close, like they were watching. Judging. The city had no softness in its posture. Even the air tasted different. Metal, movement, money. Camilla gripped the steering wheel tighter, eyes wide as they crossed the bridge. She'd never driven this far. Never. Left Oklahoma except for her father's funeral. "Mijo," she whispered, "do you really think we belong here?" Elian didn't answer, because in truth, he didn't know. The New York Youth Philharmonic Academy sat between 2 glass towers in Manhattan, like a red brick time capsule holding its breath. The entrance was quiet, polished brass handles, wide marble steps that looked like they had never been touched by dirty sneakers. Camilla stood at the bottom for a long moment, holding Elian's hand like it might float away. Then she whispered, "I think this is where the air changes, Hijo." And it had. Inside, it was nothing like his school auditorium. The walls were lined with oil portraits. The ceilings so high, sound echoed with elegance. Students walked the halls like they were born here. Polished shoes, monogrammed folders, postures like posture mattered. They were everything Elian was not, and they noticed. At orientation, a girl with glossy black hair and cheekbones that looked sculpted from ivory turned to him. "Who's your vocal coach?" Elian blinked. "I don't have one." She smiled faintly but not unkindly. "Oh, brave." The room buzzed with whispered bios, children of composers, students from Juilliard Prep, kids who could read Mozart. The way Elian read street signs. Elian sat quietly in the back row, his violin case at his feet like a shadow. He could feel their curiosity, their pity, and maybe, under it all, their doubt. The placement audition was worse. He stood on stage beside a boy with perfect pitch and a girl who played Bach from memory. When it was Elian's turn, he stepped forward, lifted the violin, and hesitated. Just long enough to feel the weight of every eye in the room. Just long enough to question everything. Then, he played. Not badly, not flawlessly, just honestly. When the results came out, he was placed in the lowest ensemble. Developmental tier, the instructor said, glancing down the list. Potential, someone whispered behind him. That means not good enough yet. Elian didn't flinch, but inside something curled in on itself. Rehearsals were brutal. Dr. Monroe, the ensemble conductor, was exacting. Cold, not cruel, but clinical. You sing with feeling, she told him once, but feeling without form is just noise. Elian nodded, swallowed the words, went back to his dorm with his head down. That night, he didn't touch the violin, not out of protest, but because it suddenly felt too far away from what they wanted. Too raw, too Elian. But something in him wouldn't let go. The next evening, after the building had quieted and the lights dimmed, he wandered the west wing and found a forgotten practice room. Small, cracked tile floor, a piano missing 3 keys, a smell of varnish and loneliness. He stepped inside, closed the door, and opened the case. Not for class, not for scores, just to breathe. He played the melody he wrote that winter in the van, the one with no title, the one his mother used to hum when the heater died, the one that held the sound of train tracks, hunger, and hope. The bow slipped across, the strings warm now, almost shy. There were no flourishes, just breath and memory. He sang, not loudly, not for anyone to hear, but because the silence inside him had grown too large again. What he didn't know, what he couldn't see, was that someone had stopped in the hallway, Julian Bennett, coffee in hand, frozen in place. He didn't knock, didn't speak, just stood there, one hand resting on the doorframe as the sound bled into the quiet like color into water. When the final note fell, Julian let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. The next day, Elian was called into the conductor's office. The room was sunlit and spare. A cello leaned in the corner like it had been listening. Julian didn't sit behind the desk. He sat across from Elian, eye to eye. "You don't play like a student," he said. "You play like a memory." Elian stared at the floor. "Most. These kids have been taught how to perform," Julian continued. You've survived." Then he slid a folder across the table. "We have a mentorship ensemble. It's off the books, small, select. I want you in it." Elian's hands trembled as he opened the folder. Inside, nothing flashy. No promises of fame, just a rehearsal schedule, a name, a belief. For the first time, the music world wasn't asking him to fit in. It was asking him to be. He didn't tell his mother right away, not because he wanted to keep it from her, but because he was still trying to believe it himself. The folder, the invitation, the fact that someone like Julian Bennett, wanted to teach him. A boy who had once practiced beside dumpsters, who played with wire and glue and memory. So Elian tucked the folder into the drawer beside his cot and waited for it to feel real. And it did. But not in the way he expected. The rehearsals for the mentorship ensemble were quieter than the others. No metronomes, no constant corrections. Just 6 students, a piano, and the kind of silence that asks to be filled gently. Julian didn't teach like the others. He didn't scold. He didn't praise. He listened. And when Elian played, Julian would sometimes close his eyes, as if trying to catch something that wasn't in the notes, but somewhere underneath. Elian began to play differently there. He stopped imitating. He stopped apologizing. He started remembering. And then came the faculty showcase, an annual performance attended by donors, critics, and alumni, the kind of night careers were born or buried. Each ensemble had a slot. One soloist would close the evening. That soloist would be Elian. The announcement caused a stir, whispers in corridors, raised eyebrows, quiet discontent from those who had trained their whole lives for this kind of spotlight. "Seriously?" someone muttered. "The charity case. It's a stunt," said another, emotional bait. Elian heard every word, but this time they didn't land, because he had the one thing they couldn't take: truth. The night of the performance, Elian wore a plain black shirt and his usual shoes, cleaned but still scuffed. No tuxedo, no tailored. But he walked onto the stage like he had at River Heights Middle School months before, quiet, barefoot in his spirit, carrying the same violin with 3 strings and 1,000 stories. The lights above him dimmed. The hall went silent. And then, he played. It wasn't a showpiece. It wasn't meant to dazzle. It was meant to remember. Each note was a fragment of something once lost. A van under a winter moon. A father's laugh in the rearview mirror. A mother ironing a shirt with the bottom of a skillet. The bow moved gently. Never in haste. His fingers hesitated just enough to feel human. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't supposed to be, because what poured out of Elian that night wasn't music. It was a reckoning. When the final note faded, it didn't end. It lingered, hung, the air like steam rising off pavement after rain, and no one clapped. Not at first. They just sat there, still wide-eyed, listening for something they didn't know they needed until it was gone. Then slowly, like dawn, came the first pair of hands, then another, then the wave, a standing ovation that rose not from admiration, but from reverence. That night, a critic tweeted, "He doesn't play the violin, he bleeds it." Another wrote, "He sings like someone who's lost everything and found something even better." The next morning, the dean's office called him in. It was early. Sunlight pooled on the marble floor like melted gold. Inside sat 3 people. The dean, a woman from the scholarship board, and a donor who had flown in after watching a grainy YouTube clip of Elian's performance. His mother was there too, flown in by Julian's insistence. Still in her diner shoes, hair pulled back in a clip that had lost its sparkle long ago. She sat with her hands clenched in her lap, not saying a word, until the donor turned, tears in her eyes, and said, "If you let this boy go, you've forgotten why music exists." The full scholarship came with a letter, handwritten. It didn't say much, just, "Thank you for reminding us what can't be taught." Camilla wept, not from pride, but from release. Years of holding it in, every shift, every no, every prayer set into a cold pillow, washed out of her in a single, unstoppable tide. She hugged her son, and for the first time in his life, Elian didn't feel small. They moved into a tiny apartment on the Upper West Side. It wasn't much, paint that peeled in the bathroom, a kettle that took forever to whistle. But it had windows, and space, and a door that locked from the inside. And that was more than enough. The fall term began. The work was harder, the pressure greater. The doubts still crept in sometimes like cold air under a door. But Elian had tools now. And more than that, he had a center. He didn't need to prove he belonged. He just needed to remember why he was there. One day, in vocal class, the instructor handed him a Schubert piece. Dense, foreign, elegant in ways he had never touched. He stumbled, missed notes, forgot lyrics, then paused. "Can I try that again?" he asked softly. "Not perfectly, just honestly." The IU room fell silent. He began again, and this time he didn't sound like Schubert, he sounded like Elian. The years passed slowly, and then all at once, Elian's name began to appear on student programs, then on critics' lists, then on tickets and posters, in fonts large enough for people to notice before they walked past. He toured, he recorded. He played for audiences that filled grand halls, velvet chairs, chandeliers, balconies heavy with silence before the first note. And still, he carried the same violin. Not always for the performances, no, but always in his heart. It hung on his studio wall, gently worn, the fishing wire string replaced at last, the crack still visible like a scar he never tried to hide, because that violin was never broken. It had simply lived. He played for kings, for presidents, for children too afraid to speak, for refugees in tents, listening through tears, for prisoners, for the lonely. But the moment he remembered most clearly, the one etched into his soul, was not played beneath golden lights. It was played beneath flickering ones. It happened years later. He returned to River Heights for a benefit concert. Not in a concert hall, but in the school gymnasium where it all began. The folding chairs were still scratched, the basketball line still faintly visible under the stage floor. The banner was handwritten this time. Hope Notes, a fundraiser. For underserved youth. Elian didn't promote it, didn't invite press. He didn't want a show. He wanted to come home. He walked onto the stage in silence. No one introduced him. He didn't speak. He simply picked up his violin, his real one, the old one, and began. The piece he played had no title, no lyrics, just breath, just heart, a lullaby made of memory and wire and rain on a van roof. It carried the crack of cold metal, the weight of hunger, the warmth of a hand resting on your head when you think the world has forgotten you. The music swelled and faded, stitched, with the sound of train horns and whispered prayers. And at the very end, just before the final note, Elian whispered it. One line, the only lyric. You stood alone, so I could stand at all. Then he played the last note and let it fall. No one clapped, not yet. There was only a stillness so complete it felt sacred. Then, a single chair scraped backward, soft, unmistakable, and from the front row, Camilla Cruz, his mother, stood. Her hands were pressed to her chest, tears spilling freely, eyes wide with something deeper than pride, recognition, love, victory. And one by one the room followed, not clapping, not filming, just standing, in reverence. Later, someone asked Elian in an interview, "What was your proudest moment?" Carnegie. Hall? The gold record, the international tour? He shook his head. No, he said softly. It was when my mom stood up, because maybe that's what makes a life. Not the stages you reach, but the people who rise when you need them most. Not the applause you earn, but the silence you break with truth. Elian never stopped playing, but no matter how far he traveled, no matter how large the audiences grew, he always carried the boy who had played barefoot on a stage not made for him. The boy who stitched sound out of scraps. The boy who turned silence into something the world had to stand for. And maybe that's the lesson, that broken things can still sing, that small things can still echo, and that a voice, when given with honesty, doesn't need perfection. It only needs to be heard. If this story touched your heart, even just a little, please consider sharing it. You never know who might need to hear it today. And if you believe in quiet strength, in stories that heal, and in voices that deserve to be heard, we'd be honored if you subscribe to the channel. Your support helps these stories keep finding the people who need them most. Thank you for listening. Truly.